Sophia. It was an honor to take
Thank you. Welcome. Hope everybody is either had lunch or is in the process of having lunch. Feel free. I mean, we are going to be on the topic of eating and food, so feel free to put that into action as we are together this afternoon. And when thinking about this class and when to place it, leading up to Pesach seemed like the right time, because this is a time of year when, I won't say all, but many Jews think about what they eat, why they eat what they eat for a period of time, what they grew up with, how they might change what they grew up with, or their current practices. Food around Passover is a topic of conversation for the weeks leading up to the holiday in my home.
Tortillas.
Well, right, so I grew up not eating bread, but not changing over dishes or being very strict about other Passover restrictions. My wife grew up in a kosher home with different dishes for the rest of the year, and then also different dishes for Passover, and still keeps quite traditionally kosher, especially around Passover. And so there's a constant conversation of what does that mean for our home? What does that mean for each of us or our children? And so the thinking about what we eat, why we eat, the meaning that it can have for us, all of that is sort of, at least on my mind, and to some extent, I imagine many of you. And so I thought it might be a good time to talk about eating from a values-based Jewish way of thinking, and how we live our values and the values that we hold dear, and examining how we might live our values more in the area of food and buying food, cooking food, eating, because it's something we do a lot, right? And potentially this would be an area where we could put our values into practice quite regularly if we don't already do that. So I'm not approaching this with any expectation of what your values are or should be around food. I'm not here to evangelize anything, or to judge somebody keeps kosher or not kosher, or to what level of kashrut, and none of that. So I hope this will be a free-ranging discussion, and might also be one that, in addition to the personal side of things, might lead us to think about what it might mean from a congregational perspective to eat and source and put out food according to our values. So I first want to share an excerpt from Rabbi Sheila Peltz-Weinberg. And I'll put it up on the screen if you are more of a visual learner rather than just an auditory learner.
Rabbi Jake, do I need to make you? Oh, good.
There we go.
David Bryan speaking. Hello?
David Bryan, could you go on mute?
Yes, but I'm in a meeting.
I'll do it. I got it.
Okay. So just as a way of framing this conversation, all right, she says, eating is the primary way that human beings interact with the rest of nature. We are composed of the same elements and compounds that make up our food. Indeed, when we eat, we transform a part of nature into energy that we can use for conscious purposes. The system of kashrut causes us to pause and consider that while we are part of nature, we are endowed with a unique potential to make choices in the way we respond to life. So again, not assuming any level of kashrut by anybody or expecting that, but she, at least in talking about kashrut, is speaking about ways we can interact with nature and then put that energy into our lives, right? And do with our lives what we believe is right. So before we jump into texts and what other people have had to say about this, I'd love to know from you, in thinking about your own values that might be relevant to this topic, what values might you identify as playing out in how you source it and eat your food? What values would you say are what would be primary for you when trying to make those decisions?
I think people underestimate how much eating in season and eating local is. That like an orange from a local farmer in winter is going to be better than the best organic free source that was shipped over, kind of thing. And then I think we're also really privileged in the fact that we are in the coastal city and do have access to that kind of fresh produce often for fairly cheap. But I think cost is a major thing for me, obviously, and just what can I afford to eat and what can I take from work and how can I make that last as long as possible? I think overrides everything else.
So I'll put out there then that being able to choose what you buy and eat is in many cases a luxury, right? There are still choices we can make, but there are some values we might put out there that lead us, down a road of saying, I want to eat or buy in this way, which could be more expensive, right? And so this is sort of a Maslow's hierarchy of needs thing too, right? That as you climb up the ladder, you might be able to buy and eat according to your values more so than if those foundational needs are not yet met.
And I tie it into something similar but different, like composting, for example. So it's food related, but not necessarily eating. So like Rabbi Jacobs, in our building, we compost. And so I actually even started taking my compostable bags with me to the beach and putting it all in the refrigerator and then bringing it home with me to compost it in DC. So I think last Shabbat dinner, I brought compostable plates, which I'll do again. So I think I look at it sort of in a more holistic way when it comes to food, not just the ingredients, but what happens to it after.
So a good reminder that it's not only about choices made at the store before you eat and at the table or in the kitchen while you are preparing and actually eating, but also after the fact, right? What you do then with extras, with waste, with containers, and maybe that goes into the cycle of when preparing again, how much are we buying, what containers are our foods in, right? So thinking about it holistically. But before we go into what it actually looks like, whether it's composting or local, organic, distance foods, before we actually go into the nitty-gritty of it, let's back up and zoom out a little bit to what values are guiding us in those things.
One of the things for me is trying to make sure that I eat things that are fairly healthy and that are not over processed. So
Okay, so health is a value, right?
health is a value, and simplicity, I would say, is a value.
Mindy, I'm gonna put some words into your mouth, because you were talking about composting. My guess is that a value behind that is, being part of the world and ensuring that our world is sustained, long into the future. So, right, environmental impact and, being a steward of the land and, future generations live over it, right? So those are, I imagine, are the underlying values behind the decision to bring your compostable bags to the beach and then make the habit of bringing it back so that you compost. Stuart.
Hi, can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, okay. It's a little hard to see. So I guess going back to, I would just go back to the original values that are expressed in Torah about kashrut. And I think there were two principal things that struck me very early in my life about that. One was the issue about killing animals and for food. And Judaism, it seems to me, was on a long developmental arc from human sacrifice to animal sacrifice to ethical killing and so forth. And so that one of the issues is whether we believe in killing animals for food. And it sparked me in my early 20s to become vegetarian and then pescatarian later. The second value issue I think of is contained in the admonition not to see the kid in its mother's milk, which in kashrut we have the separation of dairy and meat meals. But another way of looking at that is the attention, the ethical attention that early Jewish thinkers had about the impact on killing animals on relationships. In this case, the maternal-infant relationship, the kid and the mother. And I think that one of the things about this that has struck me in recent years is that only birds and mammals have attachment between parents and offspring that lead to rearing behaviors, attachment, and feeding behaviors. And all earlier animals lack the brain development to do that. And so I think another issue is, as we think about kashrut in a more modern context, is how we would think about translating those values in the present world.
So it sounds like, and I'll give the Hebrew phrase to one of these values that I think you expressed, which is tsar ba'alei chayim, that we, whenever possible, protect against the suffering of animals, which is definitely a concept in the Torah, and then later developed in rabbinic texts, and is something that that is definitely a part of the conversation when we talk about what it means to eat and even, what it means to eat and to gain our sustenance or enjoyment even from animal products or
Right.
animal flesh.
And then I think that links up in some ways with some of the previous comments about the environmental and climate impacts, so that eating a more plant-oriented diet also contributes to reversing some of the problems, or not contributing to some of the problems associated with environmental degradation.
I think it's important to note the values behind those decisions, because somebody might come to the decision of being pescatarian for a variety of reasons, or a variety of reasons at the same time, right? It might be that somebody is most concerned with tsar ba'alei chayim, with the suffering of animals, and that would cause them to not eat their flesh. It might be that somebody is concerned with environmentalism, right? And that might be a reason to not eat meat, or dairy for that matter. It might be that somebody is concerned with health, right? And that would lead them down the same road. So I think it's important to not go immediately to the practices, right? But also to step back and say, what does this practice mean to you? Why have you arrived here? And also to note that the same value might lead two different people in two different directions. Or it might lead the same person into two different directions for two different meals, right? Right, that if you are concerned with health, right, you might choose to eat a lean meat, right, in one meal, and it may be in another meal it would choose you to go more towards the vegan option, right, with the same value in mind. So identifying the value as the driving force and then figuring out where you go with it, I think is potentially a helpful thing, which is why I wanted to start with that list. And did I miss any that you might be thinking about? Yeah, there.
I think another thing,
It's on, Larry.
I think another thing for me is that the idea of balance. They say we should eat a balanced diet, but I think just it reflects balance in our lives, maybe, and the virtue of the value of balance in things, in our lives, what we eat, in nature, in our communities, kind of things. Balance.
Change my answer. I think I arrived at eating local is better because I remember now that I wanted to reduce the amount of resources that I used in what I eat. Because so much goes into industrial food production and it was scary to me.
Right, so a desire to not waste, right, is another value. Ruth or Alex.
Yeah, also, kind of like brachot, mindfulness of not just putting anything in your mouth that happens to come across your table, and being aware of what it is you're eating and the impact that has, and then knowing what the impact is, making decisions based on that.
Yeah, so mindfulness might be another value that you have. Not exactly what you said, but also what comes to mind is wanting to connect with, you could say, the divine, right, with something larger than ourselves, that connection, right, or spirituality might be a value that guides our eating and the choices we make, of wanting to use this moment that we do, or the multiple moments throughout the day when we are consuming, to use that for religious purposes or spiritual purposes, for connection. So there are many ways, I would say, that we try to live our values, whether that's being part of a community, whether that is going out into nature, whether that's prayer and study, whether that's doing mitzvot, or being kind to others, right? There's so many ways that we try to live our values out in the world. But I'll speak individually, I don't always do that, right, when I'm eating or when I'm deciding what to eat. And so why would this thing that we do around 3 times a day, why should this be any different, right? What an opportunity that for something we do regularly, what an opportunity to put our values into practice. Not an easy thing necessarily, but an opportunity. So that's kind of how I want to approach looking at some of these texts and some of these ideas. Again, not saying that this is what you have to do or believe, but putting out there ways that some Jewish thinkers and texts have conceived of this. And so when we think about eating according to Jewish values. And I think we've already identified some of that. One of the first things that comes to mind is the eating of animals and or animal products. And is that something that is in line with our values? Is it something that's not in line with our values? Is it something that's allowed by our tradition? And yes, but is it allowed willfully or grudgingly? So I wanted to look at some texts around that. And then we'll look at some other categories as well. So starting with the book of Genesis, this is Genesis chapter 1, so quite early on, when God is speaking to the first human. God blessed them, and God said to them, "Be fertile and increase, fill the earth and master it, and rule the fish of the sea, the birds of the sky, and all the living things that creep upon the earth." God said, "See, I give you every seed-bearing plant that is upon all the earth, and every tree that has seed-bearing fruit. They shall be yours for food." So, what is God allowing the first human to eat?
He's telling them to be vegetarian.
Vegan even, right?
Even vegan, yeah, vegan.
Right? It seems like God is prescribing a vegan diet to the first humans, right? That they are to rule over the earth, right, and all the things in it, but it's the plants that they are allowed to eat. So that's Genesis. That's in Eden, right? So then what happens? Well, when we get to Genesis 9, just a few chapters later, many generations later in the text, right, we're now in the story of Noah. And this is, of course, after the flood, and they've sort of emerged, and now God is telling them sort of how to live on this almost new earth. God blessed Noah and his sons and said to them, "Be fertile and increase and fill the earth. The fear and the dread of you shall be upon all the beasts of the earth and upon all the birds of the sky, everything with which the earth is astir. And upon all the fish of the sea are given into your hand. Every creature that lives shall be yours to eat, as with the green grasses I give you all these." So, a new rule or a new allowance for the generation of Noah and presumably going forward, right? That essentially there are no limitations as to what is yours to eat. So there have been a number of generations where it was just the vegan diet, the plant-based diet, and now it is wide open with Noah and his sons for humanity. This is not, I should say, for the Israelites or for the Jewish people. This is for Noah and his sons, so for all of humanity, or most of humanity, let's say. So there's a change, right? And as far as why that changed, that's where commentators come in. But the Torah text itself allows for humans to eat of the animals. Every creature. So here's Rashi on that piece from the earlier on in Genesis, and then also addressing this piece of Genesis. So Rashi are pretty much authoritative medieval commentator. Right? Scripture places cattle and beasts on a level with them, the human beings, that is, places all alike in the same category with regard to food, and did not permit Adam to kill any creature and eat its flesh, but all alike were to eat herbs. So that's what he means, that the people were on the same level as the cattle, right? That all of them were to eat herbs or plant-based. But when the era of the sons of Noah began, God permitted them to eat meat. For it is said, "Every creature that lives shall be yours to eat. Even as the herb that I permitted to the first humans, so do I give to you everything." So Rashi's just kind of putting that into perspective of what happened between Adam and Noah. That Adam was no different than other animals, which I guess the animals were also not given permission to eat other animals. I'm not sure. Maybe that's how there was harmony on the ark.
I mean, is the reason for this change that the animals would be dead if the humans hadn't saved them? And therefore the animals are beholden to humankind.
Right, so we could ask, what's behind this allowance, right? Is it just that the animals owe their lives to humanity and therefore humanity can benefit from the flesh of the animals? Is it that God saw that there was a violent tendency in humans, and if there is no outlet for that, then the humans might turn against one another, right? And therefore they have the permission to turn against the animals, so as not to commit murder. Ruth or Alex, is that a new hand?
Yes. So I wonder in the flood, what happened to all of the plants? Because most plants thrive on fresh water, not salt water. One might assume that the flood was salt water, given it was the oceans that overwhelmed everything as well as the rain. So maybe it had to do with there wasn't enough plant life because it had not yet recovered, that in order for them to survive, they had to eat animals.
So maybe the value behind this is survival, right, of the last remaining human beings, right? That if there are no plants for them to eat, right, like there's an olive branch, we know, maybe it's not fruiting at this point. That it's just by necessity, right? That survival is a value, right? That the perpetuation of the species or of a family is a value, and it might inform what you eat, right? Depending on where you are on that hierarchy of needs. Right, I remember watching Bear Grylls, right? This survivalist who goes out into the wilderness and has to survive on what he can find. Right? Survival is the value there. It's not about taste or about environmentalism even at that point. It's what can I get my hands on. So maybe that's what's going on with Noah and his sons as well. Although we do know that Noah plants a vineyard pretty quickly after he gets off the boat. So presumably that he would have some plants to eat pretty quickly, if not immediately. Yeah.
Was there not also like seed storage? Because they don't have to be eating something other than each other. So I just always thought that there was like a cache of like a seed library, and therefore that's what they were like living off of basically this whole time. Or do I just like invent that in my brain?
I don't think the Torah talks about a seed library. It doesn't say like you must have like a
do whatever you are.
yeah, or like on the ark have a female and a male plum tree so that they might pollinate and the bees can do their things, pollinators. It doesn't say anything like that. It doesn't seem to care so much about the seeds and the variety of plant life. So I don't know. But I like that idea. I mean, I know there are seed libraries around, including one, very much I think in the Arctic, right? In case, so, I'm pretty sure that didn't exist at the time of Noah.
Yeah.
But I don't know. So then we also get even more allowance from the book of Deuteronomy. So now we're in the last book of the Torah, and in Leviticus, let's say, it seems like the only time that the Israelites will eat meat is when it's in the form of sacrifice, right? Done at a central location, right? In the Torah, it's the tabernacle, it's the movable sanctuary that they have with them. Later on, it would be the temple in Jerusalem, right, where the sacrifices would take place. And so if you just read Leviticus, it seems like if you're going to eat meat, it's only going to be on these very special occasions when you make a sacrifice. So if you're living far away from Jerusalem, you need to take the trip to Jerusalem on the pilgrimage festivals, and those are the special moments when you get to eat meat. Deuteronomy comes along and makes for more allowances here. Right? It says, when Adonai enlarges your territory, and God has promised you, and you say, I shall eat some meat, for you have the urge to eat meat, you may eat meat whenever you wish. Right? So not just in the form of sacrifice, and not just in Jerusalem. If the place where Adonai has chosen to establish God's name is too far from you, you may slaughter any of the cattle or the sheep that Adonai gives you, as I have instructed you, and you may eat your heart to your heart's content in your settlements. Okay, you don't have to go to Jerusalem. You don't have to wait for Pesach. But when your heart is telling you that you want meat, then you can have meat, is what Deuteronomy is saying. That you can slaughter an animal that God has given you, and that is yours to eat. So desire, right? Desire is now playing into it. Right? Because you have the urge whenever you wish to your heart's content. Right? This is the language of Deuteronomy and the allowances that the text is making for eating the flesh of animals. Great. So then Nechaba Leibowitz reads this. She was a modern contemporary Torah commentator. And she said, how grudgingly is such permission granted, right? If you cannot resist the temptation and must eat meat, then do so. Seems to be the tenor of this barely tolerated dispensation. So she's reading this piece of Deuteronomy and saying, like, it says that she's reading this and said, if you like your body is just telling you you must have meat and you like can't live without it, then you can have the meat that you want. But she's reading it as God kind of being, I guess, a bit annoyed with the Israelites and their desire. I don't quite see that in the text, but it's probably interesting that she would read it, as being granted so timidly, I guess, or I thought it was an interesting way to read this text that seems, very kind of wide open. And she's saying, God doesn't really want to do this, but it feels like God's hand is forced, as it were. Any reactions? Yeah.
Was it ever a thing that people were doing stuff in order to do sacrifices? Like, I'm thinking about sometimes cooks in the kitchen will purposefully mess up food so they get to eat it themselves. And is that why there was like precautionally this like acceptance of like stop doing things you can have your barbecue, you can just eat meat fine now, you're okay.
So the chef say, I put too many black truffles on this, I guess. I
I was also thinking about, in more modern times, how people in poorer countries would eat vegetarian and it was a treat for them to have meat, when they could afford to put meat in whatever it was they were making. So I'm wondering if the allowance now to eat meat came from, I could be completely wrong off, but that maybe the society at the time was a richer, quote unquote, society, and then meat became more of that luxury, as it does in more modern times today.
Yeah, it's possible that once they're in the land and settled, right, they have flocks and herds, that meat can be something you have more often and not just, very rarely when you go to the temple.
Mini bag.
And so maybe that it was more available and prevalent, and then as Jews started moving around and not having their own land to grow, to be shepherds upon, that maybe meat became less frequent, and maybe many of Jewish communities were impoverished for a variety of reasons, and so it became a treat, right? So I think it kind of has expanded and contracted throughout Jewish history, and as a result of Jewish history. And we're certainly in a moment where meat is abundant and available. Probably for I don't know exactly, the last 100 years or so, in America at least. I don't know exactly, I know like in the 50s and 60s for sure, sort of expanded, but I don't know before that exactly what it looked like. I guess with the Depression, probably not so prevalent, right? But now that we live in that, in the prevalence, yes, things are getting more expensive, but many can still afford meat on a regular basis. So what does that mean, right? But if this text is a guide, right? Is it whenever you want? Is it that it's a permission that's granted grudgingly and only when there is, an almost insatiable desire, that then it's granted? Should it be a treat or an everyday kind of thing, just whatever you want? That's, the way you read the text might inform the choices you make, what you order from the menu.
Is this also connected to Deuteronomy's centralization of sacrifice only in the temple in Jerusalem? Because before there were other places you could sacrifice. So they're saying, okay, you can only offer sacrifice in Jerusalem, but you can still eat meat in other places.
Right, yeah, Deuteronomy is largely seen by scholars as a consolidation, right, of power in Jerusalem, and there were other sites that popped up that people would go to for sacrifice, and Deuteronomy says you can't do that. So if they are saying you can't have these more localized places where you can have meat, you can only be in Jerusalem, then the allowance they're making is that's not the only time you can have meat. You still need to come to Jerusalem for sacrifices and for the holidays, but you can have meat elsewhere. Stuart.
So just going back to what you said about, is it Leibovitz's comments?
Yes.
Yeah, I don't know if it's grudging, I wouldn't say necessarily, but I would read it in a little different way, which might be, could we look at it as saying, well, if you have the urge to eat meat, then you're not prohibited from doing it. It's not a sin. But it doesn't say that it's good to eat meat or that you should eat meat.
Right. Right, absolutely. Ruth.
I'm wondering whether, given the timing of when Devarim was, quote, written versus the rest of the Torah, whether it's just trying to deal with the reality of being in societies where other people are eating meat, and people are going to do it anyhow because everybody else is. So you might as well put it in there that if you have to, you can.
Yeah, and there is a concept, you might say, a value in Jewish thought about against making the majority of your community into sinners, right? Or making a law that would, or making a ruling that would automatically make it so most of your people are in violation of that rule, right? So if, in the time of Deuteronomy, it was a widespread practice to eat meat, not at the temple and not only on these holidays, and the one who was putting this book together knew that people were doing this anyway and weren't going to stop. That then maybe this is an allowance that is granted because to not grant it would further alienate people or be disastrous for the author or for the people who wanted the people to remain in the community. And I'm just looking at the comments from the Torah perspective, what is meat? The Torah doesn't really define that, although when, there's a question when talking about kashrut, why if it's boiling, a prohibition against boiling its mother's milk, why then can't you have a chicken farm, right? Because chickens don't make milk. There are a couple of explanations as to why poultry are in that category of meat. One of which is that when the Israelites were calling out to God for meat in the wilderness, God sent quail, and they were satisfied with that, right? So the flesh of the bird must have been under that category of meat because they were satisfied with that. Whereas fish, according to kashrut, it is not considered meat, right? That's parv, that's neither dairy nor meat. So it's not quite anything with eyes. Although if you look at Genesis, it seems to say that the allowance that was made to Noah included fish, right? That whereas for Adam and Eden, fish were not included in what they could eat. So what's considered meat? Is it vegetarian or pescatarian that we're talking about? The Torah doesn't really weigh in on that. We can kind of look at those hints and say, and draw our own conclusions, but the Torah doesn't say, here is what is meat. The Torah does say, here's what's for you, the Israelites, right? Here are the kosher animals, and it includes talking about fish, right? And so with both fins and scales. And for the mammals, those that both have cloven hooves and chew their cud. And then none of the creepy crawly stuff except for a few things here. And that's specifically for the Israelites, not for all of humanity. But doesn't really address what's meat in that way. So now we get to Ramban, to Nachmanides, who, commenting on a different part of the Torah, on the holiness code in the book of Leviticus, which calls on the congregation to be holy like God. So he's commenting on this thing that says, be holy. And he says, be holy by abstaining from those things which are permitted to you. For those who drink wine and eat meat all the time are considered scoundrels with a Torah license, right? So the Torah allows for you to drink wine. The Torah allows for you to eat meat. But he's saying what it means to be holy is to abstain from those things that are actually permitted. In this, it's a long commentary. He talks about sex as well, right? That sex is certainly allowed, but to be holy is to not just go after every lustful impulse that you have, right? That restraint and boundaries are part of holiness. So if holiness is the value, right? Striving to be as godlike as we can and to live holy lives, he's saying if that's the value that we're trying to live by, then maybe we do refrain many times from eating meat or drinking. So thinking about what we consume with holiness as sort of, the thing that we're striving for.
This reminds me of, it's like saying, everyone today is into instant gratification. And so this is the opposite of that, saying, refrain, control yourself, don't act on every impulse. And he would not like Jewish Italians who have to have their red wine every night with dinner, right?
My grandpa must have been Italian.
I think some of us around this table might be
Yes.
too.
I used to say my grandpa had 3 beverages: red wine, black coffee, and whole milk. Okay, so then when you see writings about Jewish vegetarianism, one of the main people that is included in that is Rabbi Abraham Isaac Cook, who was the first chief rabbi of Israel. And so here's what he said. There's hidden reprimand between the lines of the Torah in the sanction to eat meat. For it is only after you say, I will eat meat, because you lust after eating meat, then you may slaughter and eat. The only way you would be able to overcome your inclination would be through a moral struggle, but the time for this conquest is not yet. The commandments therefore came to regulate the eating of meat in steps that will take us to the higher purpose. In the course of time, people will be educated. The silent protest will in time be transformed into a mighty shout, and it will triumph in its objective. So he is saying, yes, the Torah does allow you to eat meat, but he's reading it similarly to Nechama Leibowitz, right? That is a grudging thing, and that within the lines of the Torah, it's saying it's only after you say, I will eat meat, that you are then allowed to slaughter. And so he's saying, there's this, almost uncontrollable desire, and then yes, you're allowed to do that. And he's saying, but that's not the ideal, right? The ideal is to overcome that desire, and that therefore to not even have that desire to eat meat, or to maybe have that desire but be able to recognize it and then let it go. And so he's saying, you know what, we're not there yet as a Jewish people, right? The time for this conquest is not yet. And so given that we are not yet at the point where we're not having this desire, there are boundaries around when and how you can eat meat. We talk about kosher slaughter, right? About waiting a period of time after eating meat, before having dairy, about not mixing meat and dairy, right? There are regulations around that to sort of tame that desire. And eventually, we as a religious community will get to a point where we no longer have that desire, or where that desire is controllable. Right, so that's what he said, and that's how he read that piece from Deuteronomy. Reactions to that? Check.
I think it's an interesting way to look at it, but that it's very much of its time, and the way that modern food production has come about has made this that much harder, that it's not costly to get meat. It's cheap to go to a McDonald's and get, used to be cheap to get a 99-cent burger or a 30-cent burger back in the day. But the idea that people will come to their senses, because that's what it seems to be saying here, is you'll figure out that you don't actually need this and you'll stop slaughtering animals. It's made that much harder by modern society and just everything going on in the world.
I'm curious what the basis is for his asserting that the time for this conquest is not yet. Is there a text to support that?
Not that he quotes, so I don't know where he's drawing that from, but it might just be that he looks around and sees that people aren't ready for that yet, that he's in touch with his community, and says that that's not an ask that I can make of my people.
Maybe it's tomorrow.
And Jeff, in thinking about, how easy and inexpensive it is, right, to get meat, right, that we don't need to regularly think about the suffering of the animal because of where we are and when we are, right, that we're not, most of us, I would say, are not involved in the slaughtering of the animal, or the raising of the animal, or the slaughtering of the animal, that it comes to us in a package or pre-cooked. And we, if we want to, can not think about how it got there. And so in that way it is easy, and we can care about animals and about the suffering of animals and have a disconnect, right, between what we eat and the animal that it came from. By the way, I will also put out there that there are probably many people who, I would say, do care about the suffering of animals and can be involved in slaughter or hunting and are able to hold both things. So I don't want to say it's just people who don't physically slaughter animals that care about their suffering. I don't want to put that out there.
Jeff Kahn, did you have something?
Oh, actually,
Yeah.
made the point.
Oh, okay. Well, would you like to make it too?
So I'm reminded of being very young and sitting around the dining room table on a Saturday night having deli and making myself a tongue sandwich. And my sister across the table said, "How can you eat that? It's tongue." I said, "I know, it's tongue." She said, "No, it's tongue." I said, "I know, it's tongue." She said, "No, it's tongue." I said, "It's tongue," and I never ate it again.
I have a similar story.
Yeah.
So following up, could I follow up on that?
Yeah,
I
please.
think that what Jeff said and what you said in reply makes a lot of sense. It connects back to what Mindy's earlier comment was about mindfulness. And so that I think when you're aware of what you're eating, then you have to ask yourself these questions. And you may be repelled by what you're eating, the idea of it. I think you see this a lot in young children who don't want to eat a little bird or don't want to eat a bunny rabbit or whatever. And there are a lot of children who start out really with more comfort with meatless eating. And yet the other people you mentioned who hunt and nevertheless care about animals and so forth, part of the question is, does that have to do with our ability to rationalize almost anything we do?
Yeah. And I say that as somebody who's not vegetarian, right? That, perhaps willfully removed from the process. That I don't think I could slaughter an animal, let alone then eat that slaughtered animal. So I want to get to a couple other categories, but at least one more thing to say about eating meat or not. Right, and this from the Mishnah Torah from Maimonides, so another medieval commentator. Right, and so he said that the sages instructed us that the proper path is that one should not eat meat except when craving it, right? Because your soul desires to eat flesh. This piece from Deuteronomy. He says, it is enough for a healthy person to eat meat from Friday night to Friday night. The Erev Shabbat, the Erev Shabbat, right? Meaning, I think on a Friday night and then another Friday night. And then he goes on to talk about Yom Tov, right? On a festival, people should eat meat and drink wine, for there is no real rejoicing without the use of meat and wine. And this is something from the Talmud, right? That they say there is no rejoicing without meat. And so while eating and drinking, one must feed the stranger, the orphan, the widow, and other poor unfortunates. Anyone, however, who locks the doors of his courtyard and eats and drinks along with his wife and children without giving anything to eat and drink to the poor and the desperate does not observe a religious celebration, but indulges in the celebration of his stomach. So he's saying, yes, it's a way to fulfill the mitzvot of celebrating on the holiday, right? That you eat meat and you drink wine, but you also have to look out for the needs of others, right? That you can't just have this feast within your home and satisfy your own desires you need to look out for other people. So he, his driving values might not be about the suffering of animals in this context, right? Might not be about environmentalism, right? His driving value is looking out for the needy, right? And making sure that they have what they need to celebrate the holidays, right? Rejoicing in the holidays is a value, right? And that many of our holiday celebrations call for the eating of meat, right? I mean, think about your Shabbat chicken, right? Even if it's not halacha, it's not Jewish, right? Like, it's a family custom, right? And that could be another value, is being able to eat with family members or with friends and not make them feel bad about cooking something for you that they put their care into, right? Or having a family recipe that's been passed down generations, right? For grandpa's brisket, right? And that there can be a really good feeling when you cook that and think about your loved one. And then I want to say that's a value too, right? And it might be a driving value. It might be one that if you don't do it, you miss. But I want to put it out there that there are valid reasons why people would choose to eat meat on a holiday or even not on a holiday. That are there within our tradition as well. Ruth.
Yeah, this sort of goes back to the previous discussion, but just wanted to raise the issue of the difference between sustainability and subsistence, whether it's farming of plants or animals. I think about the native populations in Alaska, for instance, and the sort of food industrial complex, and whether eating meat from McDonald's versus the seal that you just caught, and what the differences are, and how one evaluates whether that is holy or not.
Right. So if we have meat consumption as a given, right, then how can we elevate that, right, to the holiest way of doing that possible, right? And with your examples as the burger from McDonald's versus something that you caught and killed and prepared. And that there's a spectrum, right, in between those two things, right? That, and maybe a ladder we can kind of climb up, sort of like a tzedakah ladder, right? That we're trying to get to the higher level, step by step. Of, how can I do this a little bit better, a little bit more ethically, a little bit more values based? Fairness to the people involved in getting this to my plate, right? How can we step that up, ever so slightly or not slightly? That's something that we can. It's not necessarily an either or, but how do I get higher up? I want to make sure to get to some other things. So I'm going to go to this story by Rabbi Shmuley Yankovitz, who is a modern Orthodox rabbi. He writes a lot, and he is an outspoken vegan and does so from a place of Jewish values. But also, this isn't specifically about that. This is about essentially workers' rights and how people who prepare food are treated. So he tells the story of Rabbi Israel Salanter, who's known for Musar, for Jewish ethics. So he says the fact that food is kosher does not always mean that eating it is ethical per se. For many, kashrut involves a commitment to a Torah tradition without any deeper moral relevance. The spiritual enterprise of kashrut can be reframed to meet humanity's ethical obligation to tend to the earth and the heavens, including tending to workers' dignity and animal welfare. At the heart of kashrut, kashrut is about dignity. An anecdote about a rabbinic ethicist helps us to understand this concept. Rabbi Israel Salanter, was the founder of Judaism's modern character development movement, Musar. The story goes that one spring before Pesach, he was called to certify the kosher status of a matzah factory. He inspected the factory and observed the conditions thoroughly. He saw that the matzah, the unleavened bread, was made according to the letter of the halacha, the Jewish law. Yet, after inspecting every aspect of the factory, Rabbi Salanter refused certification. Why? He explained that he refused to certify its products because of the poor treatment of its workers. The women were overworked, their pay was insufficient, and their needs were ignored. Because of his moral compass would not allow the consumption of products prepared unethically, Rabbi Salanter refused to certify the factory's matzah as fit for use on the holiday when Jews tell the story of their ancestors released from enslavement. So things can be the letter of the law kosher, right, and still not in the spirit of being kosher. And workers' rights could be a value that we hold, right, that informs what we buy and what we eat, where we eat, right, which restaurants we patron. So a pretty straightforward story from Rabbi Yanklowitz about Rabbi Salanter. Ruth?
Well, and excuse me, somewhat corollary to that is the how do I put this tactfully? I don't think I can. The
Don't try.
So the kosher mafia that does certifications and is not necessarily the most ethical group of folks out there.
Mhm.
And that there is certainly discussion about whether kosher versus free range versus, you know, when you're dealing with, even if it's chicken, what the mashgiach makes off of certifying something versus and what they then do with those profits, versus, you know, raising chickens in your backyard or something. There's a, just because it's certified kosher doesn't mean that it's ethical for a number of reasons.
Absolutely. We saw this in the last few years with the Mishpachah meat processing plant, which was shown to be quite unethical in the way that it treated its workers. A kosher slaughter, right? And I'm sure there are many more examples, right? So, you know, with that raises the question then, right? If you have access to, let's use meat, right? If you're eating meat, you know, a meat with a hechsher, right, that is considered kosher, so the letter of the law, and you either don't know about its record on workers' rights, or you know that it's bad. And you know the alternative is that you have access to meat that you know was raised ethically, and that it's a place that pays its workers fairly, and but does not have the hechsher, right? Then which one do you get, right? And it might be that your primary value in this moment is that something is slaughtered in a kosher way, right? If you keep a kosher kitchen, that is a must for you. It might be that your driving value is workers' rights, and that even if you would like to officially have a kosher meat, that there's something that overrides that. That's that moment of decision of, okay, what do I do here, right? Which value is driving me at this very moment? What is something I can live without, and what's something I can't live without? Larry?
It also comes to mind, it's not just meat. I'm remembering back in the 1960s and 70s with Sezer Chavez and the grapes.
Yeah.
And when some people declared that non-unionized grapes were not kosher.
So here we go, Rabbi Yitz Greenberg. Stuart, I'll get to you in a moment, but given the timeliness of this, an interview with Rabbi Yitz Greenberg, who is Rabbi Yanklowitz's teacher, also a modern Orthodox rabbi. The question from the Jerusalem Post, right, in 1971, you were one of the only Orthodox rabbis to declare that non-union lettuce and grapes should be regarded as non-kosher, and you urged Jews to boycott them. What is the basis in Judaism for your position? And so he said, halacha is not just a list of rituals, do's and don'ts, but a comprehensive worldview that applies to everything that happens around us. The Torah prohibits the exploitation of workers. So why shouldn't that apply to migrant farm workers picking lettuce or grapes? They were being mistreated, so it was natural for us to apply the principle of non-exploitation to their situation too. It seemed obvious. Right, so what does it mean to certify something as kosher? It doesn't just mean that in lettuce, right, there are no bugs, right? Because you're not supposed to eat bugs, and so produce has to be checked, right? That does not warrant a hechsher by itself, right? That the other things need to be taken into account if you are going to eat something that is deemed kosher. And so, maybe this is an exhortation, not even against the consumer, but against the certifying agencies, right? Saying, what are you doing, right? If you're certifying these things as kosher, you're completely ignoring this body of Jewish law that is it's in the Torah, right, of how you treat a worker. How could you possibly ignore this body of law when deciding if something's kosher? And so we have to say the same thing about that piece of meat, right? How could a certifying agency say that this is kosher if the workers are mistreated and they're going against Torah law in the creation of this piece of meat? Stuart.
Right. So, consistent with sort of the Reconstructionist notion of an evolving Jewish civilization, and you were referring to this yourself, I think, when you talked about step-by-step changes over time in the way that we approach these issues. We already know that there's concern not to cause undue suffering of animals through non-kosher slaughter. And I think what Ruth raises is that, what about, as we've learned more, what about the mistreatment of animals in the way that they're housed and fed in the agricultural industry? Should that also affect how we think about approval of those practices? And then today, particularly after the pandemic, I think we have to be more aware that there's certain industrial agricultural practices with animals that really increase the chances of pathogenic viruses and other things causing human disease. So, for example, you had mad outbreaks of mad cow disease or avian flu, and also the way in which certain animals are kept in outdoor markets in the third world, and how that can transfer to humans, causing disease. What is the ethical aspect of that, do you think?
Like from the Jewish perspective, or just from an ethical perspective?
Anything you like. Anything.
Well, I mean, so I think, look, obviously, health is a value, right, for humans, for the animals, and I think in many cases should be a driving value. And we know that the current way much meat is produced, and how especially meat is produced inexpensively or cheaply, in this case probably, that it is done in a less ethical way than maybe it used to be. And is meant to drive profits and increase yield, much more than thinking about the animal as a creature. and probably also not thinking much about the health, except when it gets in the way of yield. Certainly not thinking about what the life of that animal is like. So I think it should, we should look at it ethically, and I would also say it's easy not to, because there's a lack of transparency. There's a removal right from the process. And one has to be actually mindful of and be able to source, right, and trace it, which is not always easy to do. So, I think we hold these values, and then the question is, what can we do with them? And the answer might not be everything, right? And we might not be able to eat ethically for every single meal, because there are things we don't know. In part, probably by design of the system. So, I think that it's important to have our ideal in mind, and it's important to note that we might try and strive for that and also miss the mark somewhat regularly. Live with it, right? And that's why we have Yom Kippur, right? There are times we miss the mark, even though we've had the best intentions. And I think this might be an area where this is true. And sometimes it's our fault for not looking into something. And sometimes it's not our fault because things have been obscured. There's one more concept that I want to put out there, which is, you may have heard before, and this is coined by Rabbi Zalman Shaker Shalomi, which is eco-kosher. And so this is not undoing the idea of kashrut, but adding a new layer onto it. And so he said he invented the word eco-kosher to say something is ecologically kosher. So we've talked about the suffering of animals, we've talked about whether you can eat meat or not and what that means. We've talked about workers' rights, right, and what that means for what we eat. And now the environment, right? So an example of eco-kosher, he says the regular kosher way is about the dishes that mustn't be contaminated, right? So if I pick up a cup to have coffee, styrofoam would be the best thing to have. It hasn't been used before, and after I drink it, I'll throw it away. Nobody else will use it, right? There's no way for it to be contaminated by something that's not kosher. Where if you're having a meat meal, you don't have to worry about if this is a dairy cup or a carb cup, right? So styrofoam, right? Single use, throw it away, nobody else will use it. From the usual kosher place, that's the direction to go, right? That is the safest way to ensure that to the letter of the law you are keeping kosher. But in comparison to what will happen to the planet by my drinking in a styrofoam, I'd much rather make the other choice, and that's eco-kosher. So not throwing out the idea of kashrut, but thinking about what the way that we eat and what we eat, in this case, what we drink out of, and the effect that that has on the planet. So that is another layer, another value to keep in mind. And that is also a reason I know why a lot of people have decided to eat less animal products or to not eat animal products at all, is for those environmental reasons, right? The impact that raising cows has on the environment, and therefore that impacting how much beef they eat or how much dairy they consume, because of what that's doing to the climate. So, all of that said, what could this all possibly mean for us as individuals? What could this all possibly mean for us as a congregation that perhaps hopefully strives to be holy? What's doable? What do you think is not doable? How might we better live by our values?
So it makes me think at our congregational Shabbat dinners, we need to do salmon only and no more brisket. Or vegetarian. So I'm sure I'll hear complaints, but maybe next time we'll give it a shot. And then, of course, going back to what I said, to start like the composting and buying compostable things. And I mean, buying compostable things is one thing, but if you don't have a place to compost it, that's another. So you have to have a place to compost it, but sticking with that, but yeah.
Ruth?
Many years ago, we had tried to purchase only recyclable utensils, plates, cups, etc. for Oneg Shabbat, etc. And get away from styrofoam, get away from whatever else. And again, it's one of those things where pricing made it prohibitive to continue that, and I believe that that's one of the reasons it was discontinued. I mean, this goes back a million years when, oh God, I don't remember his first name, Rabbi Schwartz, who was the big eco-kashrut guy around here. And I think it was before you were even in town, Jake. We had him to do a Shabbaton or something. And so afterwards, we tried to do all of that stuff. And then, the treasurer flipped out because it just cost so much more to try and do that, which is part of my other point, which is if you go to the grocery store, and in a lot of places, prices are coming down, except on things like Tabachnik and Goldens and all of the kosher stuff, the prices are just off the charts. And again, how ethical is that to basically price gouge people because they know they have a captive audience in terms of people who want to buy kosher?
Ruth, I think perhaps now that we have a different treasurer, we should reconsider that question. And also, we're at a different point in our congregational life. And I think a lot of people in the congregation would support paying more for recyclable, if we have to have disposables, because nobody wants to sit here and wash dishes. I think the congregation would, a lot of people in the congregation would vote to have us pay more for recyclable items.
Rabbi Jake, do you want to read the comment in the chat?
Yes. So that someone makes homemade challah bread and brings it every Friday.
I said that comment was written for Jeff Burka, who does make challah weekly.
Is it made ethically?
It's made in a kosher kitchen.
That wasn't what I asked.
Is it oppressed labor?
I make sure I make small enough loaves that I don't need to take challah. Is that ethical?
I was more asking if,
Oh, no,
if Mark is your unpaid helper.
Oh, no. Oh, no. I do all the cooking, he does the dishes. It's a fair division of labor.
So I think an open question, right? What does this mean for our congregation? What does this mean for ourselves? I'll share that for Rosh Hashanah just a few months ago, in my home, we decided to have a vegetarian Rosh Hashanah, that we weren't gonna make the usual brisket. In part because my in-laws weren't coming down, and that's something that's important. The brisket is something important to them. And it wasn't that important to us, right? And now we're looking at the Pesach, we're going up to my in-laws, and we asked my father-in-law, because we know that it's, for him, that's part of what makes the holiday. It makes it feel like Pesach, right? And so we said, is that something you want? He said, yes, it is. So I think we're going to do that this year. And so it's something that it's not like we make one decision and that's what we live by all the time, but it's the fact that we are asking the question of ourselves and maybe of other people of what's essential, right? And I don't want to downplay the value of nostalgia or a feeling like something, makes the holiday feel right, that is a value too. And honoring somebody in their home, right, is another value that it could be a guiding thing. And so I don't want to paint the picture that, okay, we've had this conversation, we're all gonna walk away as vegans and asking, who was involved in making the soy milk for the tofu, right? But I think as we've said, it's about mindfulness and intentionality, right? That knowing that there are things that are important to us and that we tell ourselves we would like to live by. And so then being attentive to how we might do that more. I think that's really the point. So thank you for helping me do that. And I hope that it will be an ongoing conversation within our congregation and for our congregation. And interesting to note that the Dalai Lama eats meat from the chat. I didn't know.
From the what? Oh, from the chat.
Yeah, from the chat. I don't have any source for that except from Dee. So thank you, Dee, for that. Right, there are many, I would say, ethical people who do eat meat, and I don't want to downplay that either. Stuart.
Right, I think you're right to think of the value of community and family and hospitality. But it cuts both ways, because I can remember when I was growing up and several of my aunts and uncles and grandparents who were strictly kosher would not eat in other family members' homes, and it was very offensive to them. Or they would come with their own kosher food wrapped in tinfoil and sit at the table and eat separately. And that also had some destructive impact.
That to live by the letter of the law.
Right.
It's not always the most kind or ethical thing to do.
Exactly.
Well, Shabbat Shalom, everybody.
Yeah, sure.
Thank you very much for raising this issue, Rabbi.
My pleasure.